Sounds from the Ether. It was produced by BBC Essex and broadcast on local radio between the 15th and 22nd of November 1986.
Marconi was born on the 25th of April 1874 in Bologna and grew up at the family villa just outside the town. Throughout his school days, Marconi's teachers and his father were unimpressed by his talents, but the teenager was secretly studying the work of leading scientists. They discovered the existence of invisible electromagnetic waves, but they didn't know what to do with them, and their discoveries stayed firmly in the laboratory. Marconi's second wife, the Marchesa Maria Marconi, recounts those early days.
He was a young boy when he began to do his experiments inside his country house. He made his first experiments through the window facing, you see, the country, the hill. He knew that his first signal would have been heard on the other side of the hill, where there was a peasant who was with a gun shooting when he heard the first signal. And then it was the birth of the wireless.
That was in 1894. Marconi's waves had travelled a modest 1.5 miles, but he was convinced his development could be used as a means of communication. Immediately, he tried to sell his idea to the Italian government.
They didn't believe him. They thought that it was too much. It was incredible. And then he was full of dignity. He went home and he said to his mommy, "Mommy, you are British, we are going to England." And then he went to England.
Far from being downcast, Marconi exploited his family connections to get what he wanted. The curator of telecommunications at the Science Museum in London, Keith Geddes, says the 22-year-old Italian was helped by an early stroke of luck.
He had one key contact and he got all the rest through that. His father, of course, was Italian, but his mother was Irish. She was a member of the Jameson whiskey family. And she had a nephew, in other words, Marconi's cousin, Henry Jameson Davis, who was established in London as an engineer. Not an electrical engineer, but he had contacts with the electrical engineering world, and in particular with an engineer called Alan Campbell Swinton, and he therefore introduced Marconi to Campbell Swinton. He in turn introduced Marconi to the key person in the whole country on this sort of thing, William Preece, who was the engineer-in-chief of the British Post Office, and a very important person indeed. Marconi took his fancy. He gave him facilities for demonstrations and experiments, and from then on, Marconi was a celebrity.
City investors were now on his trail to see what they could get out of him, but Marconi was too shrewd and formed the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company based in London. Within 18 months he needed larger premises, and the company moved to Chelmsford in Essex. By now he was sending signals up to 4.5 miles over Salisbury Plain. Within months, electromagnetic waves were whipping across water for the first time, from Lavernock Point to the island of Flatholme in the Bristol Channel. Marconi knew that where wireless could beat all the competition was at sea, where no wires or cables could go, and by 1899 he was spanning the English Channel. But former Marconi research scientist Dr. George Grisdale says wireless was still very crude.
All the early experiments used electrical spark discharges to produce oscillations and waves, and until glass valves were applied in about 1912, the spark remained the only way to make wireless transmissions, and this is what the signal sounded like. In 5 years, from 1896 to 1901, Marconi had increased the range of his transmissions from 1.5 miles to over 2,000 miles.
One of the problems with the early spark transmitters was that the signal couldn't be tuned to a particular frequency. Marconi overcame this, and for the first time messages could be transmitted simultaneously between different stations in the same area without interference. Before Marconi could realise his greatest dream, which was to span the Atlantic, he also had to boost transmission power. To do this, he enlisted the services of Dr. Ambrose Fleming of University College London. Together, they built a high-power transmitter at Poldhu in Cornwall. Marconi set off for Canada with his assistants George Kemp and Percy Paget in the hope that the new, powerful signals would follow him across the world.
We had brought 2 15-foot balloons and 6 kites for the purpose of elevating the aerial, but the weather was terrible, and for a couple of days we battled with the elements. One of the balloons being carried away by the gale, which snapped the heavy mooring rope like a piece of cotton. So Mr. Marconi suggested that for his crucial test on the 3rd day we should use kites. And on that morning, we managed to fly a kite up to 400 feet. The wind howled around the building, where in a small dark room, Mr. Kemp sat at the simple receiving set, while Mr. Marconi drank a cup of cocoa before taking his turn at listening for the signals which were being transmitted from Poldhu.
It was shortly after midday that I placed the single earphone to my ear and started listening. The receiver on the table before me was very crude. I was at last on the point of putting the correctness of all my beliefs to test. The experiment had involved risking at least £50,000 to achieve a result which had been declared to be impossible by some of the principal mathematicians of the time. The chief question was whether wireless waves would be stopped by the curvature of the Earth. All along I had been convinced that this was not so.
What he heard on that December night in 1901 were 3 sharp clicks, corresponding to the letter S in Morse code. Many people claimed that what the 3 men heard was static and not telegraphy at all. But for Marconi, it was complete vindication. By 1908, he'd moved the receiving station from Newfoundland to Glace Bay in Nova Scotia. While Marconi struggled to perfect the transatlantic service, an 18-year-old British engineer, William Appleton, was preparing to emigrate to help him.
Marconi had connected up and got some signal across. Nothing very good. We were receiving daily, sometimes a few minutes, sometimes 2 or 3 hours, but never constantly. Some days were better than others, depended on the atmospherics. Marconi was just the same as anyone else, really. We're all good pals, that's all. The whole lot of us might have been enthusiastic schoolboys, you know.
Marconi was never a man to work on one project at a time. The company was training an army of ship's radio operators at Broomfield near Chelmsford. Each spark set, leased to a shipping line, came complete with its own operator. The company's former telephonist, Frank Bohannon, was enlisted to dish out the trainees' spending money.
I used to go up there once a week with their pocket money. They had £1 a week, I think it was allowed, and I used to take it up on Saturday mornings. And I can remember one of the students coming rushing out of the hut and said, "You'll come and listen to this." And there was Eiffel Tower in Morse, and they thought it was quite wonderful then to pick it up in Broomfield.
Every person who received a Morse message agreed that it was quite wonderful. In 1910, one message aroused worldwide fascination. In the most sensational case of the decade, Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen, later hanged for murdering his wife, was arrested as he landed in Canada with his mistress, Ethel Leneve. The captain of the ship on which they tried to escape had alerted the police by using his spark transmitter. Wireless was described as an invisible bloodhound following the scent over the high seas.
Crippen has shaved his moustache and is growing a beard. He has no suspicion that he has been discovered. Passengers are also ignorant of the identity of the couple. Leneve refrains from talking.
Wireless had helped hang a murderer, but it saved lives too. The world thrilled to the news that hundreds of people had been saved from the White Star liner, the Republic, which collided with an Italian ship off the American coast in 1909. The Republic's wireless operator was presented with a gold watch by Marconi himself for being the first man to show what wireless could do to save lives at sea. Wireless and the fortunes of the White Star Line were on the crest of the wave, but they came crashing down together on the night of April the 14th, 1912. As the Titanic sank, the band played on. No one could believe that something so magnificent could be destroyed. More than 1,500 people drowned. Wireless could have saved them, but the operator on the only ship close enough to help had turned off his set and gone to bed. More lives were to be lost at sea in the First World War. The Marconi Company had its work cut out training wireless operators for the Navy, and many didn't see the war out. One lucky former trainee, Freddie Dearlove from Humberside, survived 2 sinkings.
Arriving in the middle of the Mediterranean, we were torpedoed by an Austrian submarine. The ship sank in 3 minutes. We were actually picked up by a Japanese trawler, and having been rescued, looked after by the British Army, we eventually returned home.
The spark transmitter's days were numbered. The thermionic valve was being developed, which led at last to reliable speech transmissions. The principle of the valve was patented in 1904 by Professor, now Sir Ambrose Fleming, the same man who helped Marconi develop high-power transmitters. Fleming said of his invention in a note to Marconi,
"I've not mentioned this to anyone yet, as it may become very useful."
Many scientists were struggling to perfect the valve, but it was a German by the name of Meissner who won the race in 1913.
In transmission, the valve was the first really satisfactory way of producing a continuous oscillation, and also of an oscillation that you could impose speech on. Sparks were not suitable for speech. It was as if you tried to print a newspaper on a roll of stair carpet. It was too coarse a textured thing to carry speech, but the smooth oscillations of a valve could be what we now call amplitude modulated, AM, and that opened the whole realm to wireless telephony, as it was called, and then, of course, broadcasting. I think it needs a lot of effort of imagination on our part, used as we are to broadcasting, to put ourselves in the position of a man sitting there with his headphones on, listening to Morse from all directions, and suddenly there's a human voice. In fact, in one of the early demonstrations by a man called Fessenden in America, he actually played the violin as well, and that must have really rolled them in the aisles.
I nearly jumped out of my chair and took the phones off to hear who was speaking in the room. Everybody crowded round. My call must have brought them on foot to the radio room to hear this voice. Well, I don't think we can remember what he actually said. It was just a miracle to hear the voice.
Ham wireless was a solitary occupation. The loudspeaker hadn't been invented. Several people could listen together at a pinch, though, hunched over a single pair of headphones in a pudding bowl to amplify the sound. The receiver required no batteries or mains to drive it. At its heart was a crystal which drew its power from the radio waves in the air.
The crystal was a rectifier. In other words, it was a device that would allow electric current to pass in one direction, but not in the other. And if you think of what a radio wave was, it was a very rapid oscillation, getting bigger and smaller in time with the music. If you just took the average of that, which is what a headphone did, the average was nothing. But if you only allowed the positive half of the signal to get through and suppressed the negative half, then the average gave you the value of the signal, and it was the value of the signal from moment to moment that was the music. So it was a thing that chopped the wave in half and thereby rendered it audible. Most people had crystal sets because they were so much cheaper than valve sets. You could pay £50 or £100 for a valve set in the 1920s, and when you think what that is in today's terms, that was a lot of money.
The trouble was to get crystals. And we used to find out that the ironmongers used to have a grand card on their counters advertising carborundum crystal for rubs for sharpening knives. So we used to go into the ironmongers, ask for something that they knew we he had to go to the back door and carefully chip a piece of cover under him off, and away we went.
George Hemmings, armed with his crystal set, provided Marconi with reception reports on the quality of the new and exciting telephony or speech broadcasts. Marconi's American company was one stage ahead, though. David Sarnoff, who later became the president of the mighty Radio Corporation of America, was already planning the radio music box. But all Britain could offer in the way of telephony was a steady stream of railway timetables.
The announcer in Chelmsford would announce that they was going to transmit, and he would give the time and date, and then he'd start reading, and he read on until a certain time, and then he would give the time, and then he'd pause for a little while, then on again.
Inevitably, the growing army of radio hams tired of this dry diet of timetables, but in 1919 they were rewarded with the sound of a woman's voice.
I was asked to go by some people that I knew, and they said, would you come? They want a girl's voice. And so I said, yes, if you like. So I went, and I didn't know anything about it at all. It wasn't, you know, just going for the fun of the thing. It was deadly serious. Oh yes, it was deadly serious. We got 10 shillings each night. And I thought that was marvellous. I thought, to tell you the truth, I thought it was an easy 10 shillings. And I never thought any more about it, really. Then, a little while afterwards, I had a souvenir sent me by Marconi's of that event. And they had asked for anybody who heard us to let them know. And they sent me one, but when I looked in this book and I looked at the back, I saw there was a ship 1,000 miles out to sea. Well, I couldn't believe that. And I thought, good gracious.
Winifred Collins had been engaged by the Chelmsford engineers as an experimental sideshow, but there were some who realised that Marconi was onto something.
Daily Mail, June the 15th, 1920. At 7:15 this evening, a great singer will hail the world by a long trill into space. Thousands of people on land and at sea are eagerly looking forward to hearing the glorious voice of the Australian nightingale, Dame Nellie Melba, swelling through space into their instruments. Art, romance and science are all combined in the experiment.
I belonged to the Radio Hams Club then, and we went to a meeting and somebody said, would you like to go and hear Dame Nellie Melba? So I said, too true. But we only just got into the shed. We went down New Street, and just in the gate, and just in the door. And the announcer got up and announced what she was going to sing. But of course, we was well back. There was plenty of high-ups in front of us. And she got up and sang.
The British hams went wild, but no sooner had Marconi whetted their appetites than the Postmaster General snatched their new treasure away. He maintained Marconi was no longer using telephony experimentally and withdrew their licence. The amateurs, represented by the Wireless Society of London, petitioned the government for the return of a permanent station. But all the Postmaster General had on offer was outdated Morse, as the archivist of the Radio Society of Great Britain, George Jessup, remembers.
People wanted to hear speech and music. there was a great deal of irritation, and the Wireless Society in itself was fortunate having some important people, including a number of MPs, who could raise the matter in the right place, and that caused the Postmaster General to give way.
The airwaves came alive on the 14th of February 1922. The new station at Writtle, just outside Chelmsford, was housed in an old army hut. It boasted a unique and idiosyncratic style.
Hello CQ, hello CQ. This is 2Emma Talk, Writtle testing. This is 2Emma Talk, Writtle testing. Hello CQ, hello. Hello Ash, hello Ash. Ash, hello. The signal's okay? No, they're not. Wave your hand if it's all okay. No waves? No waves at all. Curse. Kirk, is that all right in there? Kirk! No, not? Sorry, well, sorry CQ, closing down a moment. Hello CQ, this is 2Emma Talk, Writtle testing. This is 2Emma Talk, Writtle testing. Tonight, we have a most marvellous thing that's going to happen. We are going to receive Rome, that famous Italian tenor, what's his name? Gridlico is going to sing Non Puto Furore Pantissimo, which being translated means, it's very difficult. CQ, the concert's ended. Sad wails the heterodyne. You must soon switch off your bells. I must soon switch off mine. Now we're going to receive it. There may be some atmospherics. There may be some jamming. There may be some oscillation. Whew! But hang on, CQ. We're just going to receive it now. Hang on, CQ. Hang on, CQ. Here it is.
But Peter Eckersley, who became the BBC's first chief engineer, didn't always resort to imitation. Writtle boasted real tenors too.
We weren't simply and only interested in broadcasting this frivolous stuff that you might think that we did. We had serious artists. For instance, we had Melchior. Well, Melchior had just been married, apparently, and he'd left his wife comforted by a crystal set in Denmark, and he believed that the louder he sang, the more likely his new wife, was to hear him. And so, when the opening bars were played, he sucked in his breath, which pulled the windows shut, and he gave a bellow that shut the station down. And I remember afterwards he used to wander about the place and say, what's that bust component there? Oh, well, of course, that's part of the Melchior breakdown. That is, yes, because that thing burst into flame.
In May 1922, another Marconi station, the legendary 2LO, started in London, offering similar but more disciplined broadcasts.
This is 2LO calling. This is 2LO calling. This is 2LO calling.
Although Writtle was short-lived, it acted as a very powerful catalyst. In November 1922, a consortium of the 6 top electrical companies formed the British Broadcasting Company under the leadership of John Reith. The new company's income was generated by a license fee of 10 shillings. In America, things weren't so simple. The historian Asa Briggs describes the broadcasting there as chaos of the ether, a situation which the British government wanted to avoid. Added to that, they were anxious to snatch back some of Marconi's power.
The relationship between the Marconi company and British government had been complicated all the way through. And there was a feeling that it should not be placed as a private company in a monopoly position as far as broadcasting was concerned. There was a feeling too that some of the other companies did have some patent agreements and deals with some of the American concerns, which meant that if you pooled them all together, you'd be able to have a more rapid development of broadcasting than if you were just to allow one company to do it on its own. In America, people to begin with had somewhat similar ideas of trying to get agreement, and they were very suspicious of monopoly in the United States. But nonetheless, the drive of the small local companies led to a sprouting of American concerns and broadcasting concerns everywhere, far ahead of Britain. And the fact that that produced rather bad broadcasting for the American audiences, because there was so much interference, really made the British feel that the American example should be avoided.
Although Marconi had lost control of British broadcasting, the company continued to build and maintain the BBC's transmitters. Cecil Colborne spent many months developing 5WA, the BBC station in Wales. But despite Marconi's spectacular triumphs, many people still failed to understand the significance of his work. They thought wireless would just fade away.
While I was at Cardiff, Reith came down, and Burroughs, you know the name Burroughs, the programme man, and this man Burroughs said that in 10 years' time we should be a power in the land, you see. He could sort of see what was coming.
Guglielmo Marconi was 63 when he died on July the 20th, 1937. To the end, he was still inventing. He'd set his sights on the laser. The man who invented wireless had lived to see the BBC blossom. But Britain's first broadcaster, Peter Eckersley, was saddened that the BBC lost some of that wonderful energy which was the hallmark of those pioneering broadcasts from Writtle.
It cannot be more sufficiently emphasized that that adventure was born in laughter, was nurtured in laughter, and died in laughter. And I want to believe that if only people would see their jobs, if only people would see their lives in terms of its humour, of its excitement, and that a job well done deserves laughter, and not the solemnity of the pompous administrator on top of it. If we could only see that the thing that we do is a God-given thing, for heaven's sake, because it's creative, and it's fun, and it's exciting, then I think all these certificates, all these rules, all these rather dull regulations might be seen to be unnecessary, besides people who are essentially poets, even though they be technicians.
They all laughed at Christopher Columbus when he said the world was round. They all laughed when Edison recorded sound. They all laughed at Wilbur and his brother when they said that man could fly. They told Marconi wireless was a phony. It's the same